Good afternoon. Here we are again on Wednesday afternoon. This is Talking Drupal. We are recording live on a Wednesday afternoon in a Google Hangout. You could visit us at talkingdrupal.com. Today is episode 86. It's February 18th, 2015. And today we're talking about Backdrop. And this is a revisit to an episode we did in October of 2013, where we're going to have the Backdrop folks back on. Jen and Nate joining us today. Before we bring them into the show, let's bring in our usual guests, our hosts. John Picozzi. Welcome, John.
Good afternoon.
And John, you're going second today because Jason is not with us.
No, Jason's missing in action this week. Hopefully he'll be back with us next week.
Yeah, so if you had listened to last week's show, Jason has a new job and couldn't make it this week, so we're hoping to keep him on in the future. So welcome, John Picozzi. What's new with you?
What's new? Well, at the OOMF offices in Providence, we're actually prepping for our big move across city. That'll be taking place the end of next week. So we'll be packing up shop and moving, and we're excited about that. It's gonna be fun to be in a new space and closer to downtown.
Have you seen the new space yet, John?
I've seen pictures. I have not actually seen it in person. From what I hear, it is very awesome.
Wow, that's great. Did you guys have to do any build-out work or anything special there before you moved in?
No, it's actually pretty well built out. It's my understanding is it's fully furnished, so we're bringing some of our furniture. Yep. The only thing we had to do, I believe, is paint one wall.
Wow.
So
and who's doing that, Chris?
I don't know. I don't know who we got to paint the wall.
All right. Great. Also,
nobody asked me. Nobody asked me to paint the wall.
That's a good thing, right?
Which is good. My painting skills are good, but I don't know if they're that good.
Also joining us as usual is Nick Laughlin from Enlightened Design.
Good afternoon. It's good to be back home, I suppose. Spent 4 hours shoveling over the weekend, but I guess I'm used to the grind again. It's good to be back on Wednesday afternoons as well. Spent the last couple weeks recording from Friday, so it's good to be back.
That's right. Yeah, we've been doing Fridays recently, and that's because of my schedule's been a little difficult. But Nick, last week when you joined us, you were in a hotel room in San Diego.
Yeah, I'm kind of missing that right now.
Yeah, I was wondering that.
It was a good 75 degrees there. Over the weekend, it got down to negative 25, negative 30 here. So yeah, big difference. Big difference.
So you're not going to do any surfing today like you did last week?
No, most likely not. Maybe snowboarding, but we'll see.
Right. That's good. Well, welcome back. So we have an interesting show today. We had been waiting a number of months to send an invite back out to Jen and Nate, who are I don't know what you guys are going to call yourselves, the co-founders of Backdrop. But our show today is we calling it the Backdrop Update. So in October of 2013, when Backdrop was announced, we had Jen and Nate on, and they talked about what Backdrop was about. Since that point in time, Backdrop is in its official release, and I think there's been some updates since the initial release. And Drupal 8 has not been released yet, by the way. So we're inviting them back on today to just find out what's going on. And welcome, Nate and Jen.
Thanks.
So how about if we do? How about if you guys introduce yourselves in a sort of an official way for the people from our community who don't know who you are, and we'll start with Jen.
Sure. My name is Jen Lampton. I'm a Drupal developer. I've been working on Drupal. I just actually checked my profile yesterday. I realized I've been working on Drupal for 8 years and 4 months, which shocked me. I thought it was only 7 years, but missed my Drupalversary, I suppose. So I have a lot of experience working with Drupal. I started back in Drupal for 7 days. I have a lot of experience training. I worked for Chapter 3 as a number of years as the director of training. I taught people Drupal. I wrote a bunch of training materials for their program, which we then handed over to Acquia as part of their training initiative at the very beginning. So my experience is mostly in trying to use Drupal for myself, trying to sell sites to clients, and then trying to teach other people how to use Drupal. So that's kind of my perspective for coming to this thing.
And great, how about you, Nate?
Well, I'm Nate. My handle on the internet is Quick Sketch. And I've been doing Drupal for a long time, over 9 years now. And yeah, I'm the author of a bunch of contributed modules. I maintain the file and image module. Actually, still in Drupal 7, I'm still the maintainer for those modules. And I did a bunch of work in Drupal 8, trying to prepare the WYSIWYG editor for Drupal 8. I wrote the original editor module and CK editor module that have since been rewritten, but the original versions of those modules that are in Drupal 8.
So Nate, I was listening to a Lullabot podcast that you were on recently. What was the name of that podcast? It's a new one.
Podcast was called Hacking Culture by Matthew Tift.
Yeah, it was an excellent interview with you, and one of the things that jumped out to me in that interview was that the point you made that there are probably about 1 million Drupal websites out there that are live, and that 400,000 of them include a module that you're the maintainer of, or were the maintainer of, which is webform, which is really an important part of what Drupal has been.
Yes, and I should also say that I still am the maintainer for webform. I'm still maintaining webform and all of my contributed modules for Drupal 7. Perhaps not as actively as I might be otherwise, because Backdrop takes an enormous amount of time. But I'm still maintaining all of those modules, which is somewhere around a dozen or so.
So if you go online, if you search for Nate or for Jen in just a Google search, you can find a lot of their content online pretty quickly. Just my point is that these are not fly-by-the-night Drupal people who do not have experience and can't be found. There's lots of resources about the great work they've done, lots of online presentations of things they've done in Drupal 6 and 7. And what they're bringing to us and what we're going to talk about today is Backdrop, which is a fork of Drupal 7. So what is Backdrop?
Well, it's actually a fork of a really early version of Drupal 8. So it's if you use it, it feels like using Drupal 7. If you look at the code looks a lot like Drupal 7 because we forked early enough in Drupal 8 that they hadn't started rewriting everything massively yet. And the point of Backdrop is, it came from a place where I'm an independent contractor. I have a bunch of clients, and they're talking about, okay, should we be looking at upgrading to the next version of Drupal? And they're okay with that until they get the price tag. And then they're like, oh, well, I'm fine with my site as it is. And if they're on Drupal 6, then you have to tell them, well, your site might be doing everything you need it to do, but it's going to be at risk of, security problems in the future, and we should talk about moving you onto a platform that's more secure. And, we could do new things if you had a new site, but we can't do new things on the old site because no one else is doing new things for this old platform anymore. And it gets hard to sell that if the people you're trying to sell it to don't have annual budgets for web development. It's just part of their business that they need, but not something that they're willing to invest a lot of money in for whatever reason. So we're like, okay, well, if you're on Drupal 6 or Drupal 7 and you need to move forward, how do you move forward in a way that is super affordable? And the easiest way to do that is to just not change very much, right? If we were to only change a little bit with every incremental step of Drupal, then the cost becomes lower to all of these people that need to move their site along too. And so Backdrop came from a place where it's like, okay, Drupal 7 is approaching 5 years old here, and there's a bunch of libraries that are out of date, and we've learned a lot, especially in responsive design, in those last years. And how can we start on a platform that is very similar to what these people already know and love, but still is able to take advantage of some of these improvements that we've learned over that time?
So Jen, would you say that Backdrop is taking Drupal 7 and taking it in a direction that makes it better, as opposed to Drupal 8 that's just going in a completely different direction?
Well, both projects are making it better, so let's be clear about that. But yeah, I mean, Drupal 8 is very different from Drupal 7. It's almost a different product. The code base underneath is very different. The things that it provides are very similar. So they somehow managed to provide a very similar tool in terms of how you use it, what it looks like, to Drupal 7, but on a completely different code base. So for someone who's using a Drupal 7 site, if they migrate that to a Drupal 8 site, it'll feel very similar because they were able to keep most of it the same. But for people who are working on it, it's a very different machine under the hood. So Backdrop says, okay, well, you know, if the product is the same in the end, we can make a product based on the code that we already have that is very similar to what we have in Drupal 7. So it's more about the people who are using it. Like, if you don't like the tool we have now, then we're going to give you a new tool, and that's Drupal 8. But if you do like the tool we have now, and Nate and I are people who love Drupal, we've been around Drupal for a long time for a reason. We're lucky that we get to wake up and do what we love every day. We don't necessarily want the new tool. We want the tool we have now, but we want it improved. And so that's what we're starting on here. So it's the same thing.
Would it be fair to call Backdrop a Drupal 7.5 or something like that?
Yeah, it's kind of. I mean, I guess it depends on what your numbers.
I made up a number that was bigger than 3.
Yeah, if we're measuring the distance between Drupal 6 and Drupal 7 is 1, it's kind of like a Drupal 7.8. But if you're looking at the difference between like Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 as being 1, it's more like a 7.2 or 7.02 or some incremental amount different.
That's a very interesting perspective. So I guess, you know, moving down the agenda, why, you know, what kind of use cases do you have in mind? I mean, one of the reasons why Drupal 8 is changing so drastically is that a couple of their stated use cases is they're looking for more enterprise level companies and websites. They're looking to pull in more outside the Drupal community, off the island type developers into the fold. What kind of customers, clients, and developers are you looking for in the Backdrop community?
Yeah, so Backdrop primarily, and we say it right on the homepage of backdropcms.org, and we've been trying to be pretty consistent about this, that we've been saying that our particular target audiences, like we've specified a target audience, which in itself is makes it different from Drupal, which kind of just says it's for everybody. But we've said that our target audience is small, medium businesses, nonprofits, and education, which in general, those things don't actually have that much in common other than they all have budgets. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to make it so that Backdrop is a platform that can be affordable, and one of the primary things that makes it affordable, even though it's so similar to Drupal, you know, how are we more affordable than Drupal? That's what we're trying to accomplish, is making a platform that is less expensive to maintain. And the reason, or the way that we're making it less expensive to maintain, is putting an emphasis on compatibility. So Drupal, as you guys probably know, has a long history and a very stated goal that they don't provide backwards compatibility, at least of code and APIs in between major releases. With Drupal 8, they've taken it even kind of one step further, and now compatibility for your data is also kind of gone out the door. They've removed the upgrade path to Drupal 8 and instead put in place a migration path. So the concept is every release of Drupal, you would make a new Drupal site and then migrate your content from the old one, which I think if that actually, I mean, there's some good promise to that, and a lot of people develop their sites that way already. Kind of high-end sites use migrate module today instead of using the upgrade path anyway. But we'd like to make it so that the jump between versions and just generally jump for everything within Backdrop is not so significant, because we're maintaining compatibility as we make changes. I mean, and there's things that you have to do I mean, you'll have to make changes eventually, and we've got a good number of our own changes even in Backdrop 1.0. But making those changes kind of measured and going on like consistently moving forward, it makes it a little bit of an easier task to maintain rather than having to make these huge jumps.
So the initial little while Backdrop is gaining a foothold in the ecosystem, it might be a little bit more expensive because you don't have the contrib space, but long term it's meant to be much smoother for organizations going forward. And okay, that's an interesting philosophy.
Yeah, and the contrib space actually has been going along great. This might be jumping a little bit ahead in the agenda, but
no, go.
But it's been fantastic. Like we've now been out for a little over a month, just a couple days over a month. And in that time, we've had 25 people join the Backdrop Contrib group, which right now is just an organization on GitHub. And those 25 people have ported, I think, 48 modules in that time, which is really exciting and encouraging in a couple of ways. One is that, I mean, we've already got a good chunk of like the top 50 modules ported over to Backdrop without very much difficulty. Like I can port a module in a couple of hours usually, make it fully compatible with Backdrop using the new configuration management system and everything. But it's not so exciting that I can do it in a couple of hours. It's really exciting that these people who didn't even install Backdrop before 1.0.0 was released, decided they were going to try it out and then port a module to it, that they could pick up and learn and port a module to Backdrop within like a week of having first installed it. And that's really encouraging. And I think it speaks that our attempts at trying to maintain compatibility have been largely successful, and that people find it really similar and pretty easy to pick up the new concepts that are in Backdrop.
And we've also left in a Drupal compatibility layer. So Nate's talking about fully converting your module from being running on Drupal to running on Backdrop. But we've also left in like wrapper functions around all of the Drupal namespace functions, and we've put in some conversions from the way Drupal's API worked to the way Backdrop's API. So if all you wanted to do was drop in a module and turn it on, that can be done in a matter of minutes. So it's more about, how long does it take you to get from this is what my client needs to this is what my client gets. And we've kind of gotten two ways to do that. Like you can drop in a Drupal module and turn it on, which is good, or you can actually port that module to Backdrop and try and get it fully using configuration management and all the other new features that we added.
So Jen, can you let's focus on that a little bit. So I'm a site builder, and I've used Drupal 7, and there's 3 or 4 modules that I love to use. And how do I determine first, are they compatible with Backdrop? And if they're not, what can I do?
So for starters, the best way to figure out if it's compatible, at least at this point, no one else has tried it yet, you should just try it. We have a way that we can drop in a module from Drupal 7. All you need to do is visit the info file and add a new line that lets Backdrop know it works for Backdrop, and then you can try and turn it on. And
is that documented somewhere for for a site builder to do that?
I'm not sure if we've documented the, how to test a Drupal 7 module, but it is step 1 in how to port your Drupal module page on our API site. We have a bunch of great developer documentation over there, and it's just change your info file.
But keep in mind, I'm asking this question from a site builder, not from the guy who owns the module.
Yeah.
Right.
And so then I would just recommend trying it. Depending on what your 3 favorite modules are, they could work. If your 3 favorite modules are something like commerce and rules, or maybe even something more complicated like webform, there's a bunch of stuff that just won't be the same between the 2 versions. And so the best way for you to know whether your module is drop-in compatible is to try it. I would say that the primary reason we left that compatibility layer in there isn't so that you can grab a Drupal 7 module and run it on a Backdrop site, but it's so that the process of porting that module becomes easier. So you can get it most of the way there so that that last step can be done in an hour rather than a week or a month.
Do you guys have a resource that is a list of the modules that have already been converted?
So Nate mentioned the group that we have on GitHub. That's right now the one place you can go to see that. And those modules it's the backdrop contrib, and Nate's going to post a link to that too, I think. And those modules are modules that people are going to continue to maintain for backdrop. There are also a bunch of people who are porting modules in their own, personal repositories on GitHub, and those aren't listed there. There are people who are porting modules in company repositories, and those aren't listed there either. We are, as we speak, porting the backdropcms.org website to backdrop, and that will eventually become our canonical source of modules, just like Drupal.org is the source for its modules. But instead of hosting the modules there, they'll just point at these various GitHub repositories where the code is listed, and then that will be where you can go to find all the modules. Right now, the easiest place is to look in the group, but there are more than what you see there.
Great.
So going back to who Backdrop is for, you're kind of gearing it towards. Nate, you said that it was for small to medium businesses, nonprofits, and education is kind of where you're going with that. Do you guys feel that Backdrop not really being for big business is deterring the traction that it's getting and the adoption that it's getting?
Well, I don't think that it's affecting it in a real negative light so far, because I think the impression of Drupal 8 is already so strong that it's an enterprise platform that I think most enterprises are happy looking forward to Drupal 8 and moving to that platform as a way to upgrade their Drupal sites. So I feel like we've actually been benefiting a lot more in the fact that Drupal's marketing has been so heavy towards the enterprise that basically the market that we're targeting has been largely neglected, basically. So I think that we've been benefiting that we're trying to claim this space, and Drupal is maybe not Drupal as a product is actually trying to own the enterprise space. It's just from a marketing perspective. There's a lot of just press around it being an enterprise tool that I think it's kind of leaving these products into two separate markets. That's not to say that there won't be a lot of cross-bleed between them. Like WordPress, for example, might not be an enterprise product, but you still get a lot of enterprise websites using WordPress. And same with Drupal. Drupal doesn't really market itself as like you should use this for your blog and as an entry-level product, but you still get a lot of it down at the low end of the market as well. So even though we're trying to say that this is our particular market, like Backdrop still, for the most part, I mean, actually not even, well, there's some things that we've removed, crazy things like you can't store your entities in MongoDB anymore, for example. Like we've removed some of the swappable under layers to make it so that we're more optimized for certain situations. Like we've also dropped Postgres and SQLite support, for example, where you say we're MySQL specific. And that allows our underlying architecture to be simplified a bit. We can optimize specifically for MySQL and add some consistency and less overhead for developers because now they have fewer environments to test. So things like that, we've changed a little bit to narrow the scope of what Backdrop can do, but only in a very small way. Backdrop still can do everything that a Drupal 7 site can do and more. It's just that where we're going to be headed is towards further simplification of some underlying systems within what previously had been Drupal and is now Backdrop. Whereas Drupal is kind of the other way around, where I don't even know how many services they have in Drupal 8, a couple of hundred, I think. Almost every individual piece of Drupal 8 is swappable so that you could write out your own version of something, which helps a lot in things like an enterprise situation where you might have like a single sign-on database, or an external service of X or Y, and you want to take out one piece of your website and replace it with something else. Drupal 8 is really powerful for handling that kind of situation. Backdrop is much more aiming towards simplifying things. That some things are still swappable, common things like the caching backends, like in Drupal 7, but for the most part, we gain performance and simplification of our overall architecture by saying, for example, this is the way config works. Config is always stored in JSON files. And in Drupal 8, that's swappable, and you could store it in any number of places. So it's just kind of a difference in our approach to things.
So it's more of a specialization than a broad scattershot approach.
Right. In general, in Backdrop, we want to build things that work for 80% of use cases. And if MongoDB isn't something that applies to 80% of people, we're not going to support that in core. So we're trying to kind of cut out the stuff that is for the extreme edge cases, and that tends to be a lot of the stuff that the enterprise needs.
So I got a little bit broader question. So where do you guys see Backdrop 3 years down the road? So currently, I know that anytime there's like updates and patches to Drupal 7, security issues or whatever, you guys are porting them over to Backdrop. Like, where do you see this going a few years down the road? Do you see a separation at some point? That Backdrop is now a product of its own that really has nothing to do with Drupal?
Yeah, I mean, that is kind of the goal. Drupal 7 has an end of life, which will come about the same time as Drupal 9. Right. And, by then, Backdrop and Drupal will be very different products. We also have a very different release cycle where we're planning on adding new features to the current version of Backdrop every 4 months. And that we decided was our cycle for Backdrop 1, but depending on the size of our community, we can increase that as time goes forward. So even, the patches that we apply don't directly apply right now. They sometimes need a little fussing. And as that goes forward, we're going to be adding more modules to core. We're going to be changing the way things work. Those patches will become less and less applicable over time. We'll probably have a lot of the same problems as Drupal 7 for a considerable amount of time, but our solutions might not be the same. And there's a couple of examples of problems that have happened in both Drupal and Backdrop, and we've come to different decisions about how to solve them. And a great example is CMI, where in Drupal they decided to store all of their config files in YAML, and we looked at our principles and said, actually, it doesn't make sense for us. We're just going to store our config files in JSON. So even though we're facing the same problems in the two products, the solutions are going to be different, and that is why we have a fork. That's, we're going to be going one direction, they're going the other. And I think, just continuing to compare every decision to our principles and our guidelines and our target audience is going to help us make the right decisions for us, regardless of what Drupal's doing. That doesn't mean we need to keep an eye on both projects, but I think it's going to create a different product in the long run.
So the benefit you have today is that when patches are made to Drupal 7, you can incorporate those patches into your system. At some point, that will diverge, and you won't have the benefits that you get from other people working in Drupal. Do you see that as an issue for your product?
Well, Drupal's also benefiting from a lot of the work that we're doing in Backdrop too, and I think that because the products are doing such similar things, we'll still have that kind of shared resource for the time being. I think that both products will end up diverging. People who are working on Drupal 8 are going to end up making decisions based on Drupal 8 that don't have anything to do with Backdrop because the two code bases are so incredibly different. And Drupal 7 development will end. And at that point, it's going to be hard to have that same kind of mind share. So hopefully by the time Drupal 7 reaches end of life, Backdrop will be able to stand on its own feet, and we won't need that. But the problem space is still the same. And I think still, looking at what other people are doing in the problem space is important for everyone. That's why Drupal is using all of these, proudly built elsewhere libraries, right? So they can see what people outside the Drupal community are doing. And, we often take a look at what WordPress is doing and say, they have these user interfaces that are much better. We don't necessarily look at their code and think that's much better. But every now and then, they've got things where it's like, wow, this is really slick. We should do that too.
So that actually brings up a really, really good question for me. One of the reasons why it's stated so often that WordPress's code base is so monolithic is because of their need for backwards compatibility. Do you see something like that becoming an issue 5 years down the road for Backdrop, considering one of your stated goals is backwards compatibility?
We actually are doing our backwards compatibility stuff a lot more like the Symfony project is doing it than like WordPress. WordPress states that all of their APIs are backwards compatible forever, but their API, if you look at their site, it's like 12 functions. Like the things that actually make their API is not really what we would consider an API. And Symfony has a really great philosophy towards backwards compatibility that we're trying to model, which is basically like new stuff goes in all of the time, and you put in a backwards compatibility layer between the new stuff and the old stuff, and then when a new release comes out, you just remove the layer. So it's a trying not to stand still so much as WordPress, but we are trying to kind of move forward in a way that's easy for our existing users to follow.
Okay.
So
but again, yeah, looking at the way other communities handle backwards compatibility has been super helpful for us too.
Going back to one of our earlier questions here, why should someone choose Backdrop? I'm actually going to change that question a little bit, and if I'm sitting with a client and they fit your demographic of education, nonprofit, small medium business, what's my sales pitch to them as far as why they should choose Backdrop as opposed to Drupal 7? And obviously I don't have Drupal 8 as an option right this second, but so what's the sales pitch there as far as why choose Backdrop as opposed to Drupal 7?
Well, I think the thing that will sell clients, and hopefully this will be the case, is that if you say, if I built you a Backdrop site, it's going to be less expensive than a Drupal 7 site. That's the only way that, I mean, as far as a client is concerned, like you saying, I like, the layout system in Backdrop, and Drupal 7 doesn't have that. For your client, it doesn't really mean anything to them unless you're going to be able to deliver a site that is either better or cheaper. And so what we're trying to do with Backdrop is make it so all of the knowledge transfer from Drupal 7 is there. So you basically already know Backdrop even if you've never installed it before, although there are a couple of new things that you'll need to pick up and learn. But if you can tell your client that you spend 30% of your time, which I think is about as much time as I spend, managing features every time you have to deploy some functionality between your local host and the production site, and you can say, I'm going to be able to work and or I'm going to save 30% of my time just not futzing with deploying functionality every time you want to make a change, then that will translate to a lower cost for your client. And so hopefully, like right now we don't have contrib, but as contrib gets over and there becomes less of a downside to using Backdrop in the first place because it doesn't have that contrib base, hopefully using Backdrop will provide you with tools that make it so that you can build sites faster than you could on a Drupal 7 infrastructure.
So for right this second, and I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, but right this second, there would really be no cost savings, correct? Because I'm going to end up having to work with migrating modules or building stuff into Backdrop to get it to kind of do what I need it to do in some instance where there's a contrib module that hasn't been ported over yet.
Yeah, right now the kind of, I don't know, the rolling resistance to moving to Backdrop is a little bit high because contrib isn't there. But once you actually get going, then the maintenance should be less over the long run than it would be on a Drupal 7 site. So if we're building a new site today, Drupal 7 is probably going to be faster. But if you are willing to make the investment up front, it may be cheaper in the long term to maintain a Backdrop site.
It also depends on the site you're building and when you start it, because Backdrop will also be moving more contrib modules into core. Like by our 1.1 release, we'll have token and path auto and maybe rich text editor too. And so it's the kind of thing where, like, right now, you're starting kind of in the same place as you were in Drupal 7. But as you go forward, like the amount of stuff that needs to be ported to Backdrop will decrease as the size of Backdrop itself starts to support some of these major edge cases. So if you have a small site and it only needs 10 modules and 4 of those are going into core, then now it's only needs 6 modules, and maybe you can get half of those previously ported. And if the other few just take a few hours, maybe that'll be the difference in cost of deploying the site initially, as it would have been to package everything up in features and deploy it the way you would in Drupal 7. So it's important to choose the right projects at the beginning, where there is kind of a good way to sell that. But yeah, a year from now, hopefully it'll be cheaper to do any site. And the underlying framework is newer, right? So that's kind of something where even though clients might not understand the technical differences between the version of jQuery that's baked into Drupal 7 versus the one that's in Backdrop, you can say Drupal 7 is 5 years old and Backdrop is brand new, and that might be a good enough selling point there too. So if you can get cost equivalent, you can talk about that, and you can also talk about long-term direction of where that site needs to go. If this is a site and the clients are going to want Drupal 8 in the future, maybe starting on Drupal 7 will be the way to go, because there will be a lot of people migrating their sites from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. You can follow in their footsteps. But if the site never needs to go there, then putting them on Drupal 7 initially will mean an eventual either end of life or change of product or migration to Backdrop when that time comes too. So that's usually how I pick which projects.
One more follow up from me, and I apologize because this is going to be devil's advocate / kind of jerky, but we all have those clients out there that today the project is this way, and maybe Backdrop is like the perfect solution for today, right? And then a year down the road, it needs to integrate with, whatever it is, e-commerce, some third-party service that you've never heard before. The fact that, Backdrop seems to have like a kind of, not a narrow focus, but it has a very specific set of tools within it and abilities within it. I mean, is that going to be a cost savings if that feature that they want down the road requires custom development?
So I like to think about this as, if Backdrop is the same as Drupal 7 today, have you ever felt limited in that way by putting someone on the Drupal platform? Because I run into this problem all the time where a year from now my clients need to integrate with some new service that doesn't have integration now, and I have to build that, whether it's a contrib module or a custom module for them in Drupal 7. It's going to be exactly the same in Backdrop. I mean, the internet changes every day. We have no idea what those services are going to be a year from now, and whether there's going to be support for them in Backdrop or Drupal 7 or Drupal 8 at that time, who knows? There's always going to be custom development or contrib development involved. And so for me, it's about, what kind of code do I want to write when that happens? And if I'm super excited about all of the fancy new tools that are in Drupal 8, then that's probably the way that I would steer them. But if I'm not excited about those tools and just want to use the tools that I know and get them the fastest job done the most affordable way, then I might choose to go the Backdrop way. So, the future is unpredictable. The internet is unpredictable. But yeah, Backdrop is basically the same as Drupal 7. So I think people who are concerned about limitations should think about whether they're concerned about those same limitations in working on Drupal 7 today, because that's kind of where we're starting at.
Jen, do you guys see that? Who is your customer? So do you see that you would have a Drupal development shop building sites in Backdrop as well as Drupal 7 and Drupal 8? Like, how do you see your customer base moving forward?
Yeah, it sounds actually like that's more of a
developer base.
Yeah, developer base, but in a way that's not inaccurate, because I think we've even stated it on our philosophy pages as part of our audience that like we've kind of come to terms with the fact that Drupal and Backdrop are site building tools. They're not really, their target audience isn't so much end users as it is the site builders that build the sites for end users. And so when you say our customers, it's not inaccurate really to say the people that are building websites rather than the people that are being delivered the websites.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so in that case, our customers, like some, large maybe not large, but existing Drupal agencies or Drupal shops that do development, in teams of 6 or more people. I think that it definitely can be, because there are a lot of people that they might have within an organization that might need a bit of retraining to do Drupal 8, but could probably pick up Backdrop in a really short amount of time. Whether or not they would actually adopt that or not, I think it probably at this point depends on the level of enthusiasm from their developers. I think it reminds me of when Drupal was first getting started and moving into the enterprise in the first place. It was often some boutique section of the corporate ladder that was just like, oh yeah, we're going to go off and do this crazy thing, and it's called Drupal. And then they just introduced it into their organization, and then it kind of trickled up. Like the Drupal kind of came in at the bottom and then moved up towards the top. And I think that Backdrop will, in some ways, be driven the same way. That right now, it's kind of hard to make a sell to maybe to a site owner or to an executive to use Backdrop, because it's a question mark, it's an unknown. But from a developer's perspective, they can get in there and look at it, and within a matter of a couple of days say, whether or not they want to use that product or not. And so I think what we'll probably see is that the developers are the people that are going to be able to most readily evaluate whether or not Backdrop is going to save them time, and make the proposal within their organizations to say, we should use this because it's going to save me time, or because I like the functionality in it.
So if I'm a Drupal developer today and I'm considering using Backdrop, what are the gaps, functional gaps, that I should be concerned about in terms of delivering a website using your product instead of Drupal 7? Like, are there big things in your mind that are things that we're not ready yet, or things they should consider before choosing Backdrop?
So if your release date for this project that you've got to sell your client is before May 15th, you're probably going to need to ship without a rich text editor, because May 15th is our next product release date, and we currently have that on the agenda for getting it out then. I noticed there are a couple of people in our contrib group who have decided to start porting some contrib modules for WYSIWYG editing, like WYSIWYG module. We don't necessarily recommend that, because we would rather have that time be spent on putting it into core than on the contrib group. But some people want it now, and they're going to do it now anyway, and that's how the community works, right? People will do what they need. But I would say, if I have a client that needs a WYSIWYG editor and they need the site out before May 15th, I wouldn't choose Backdrop.
Is there any customer that doesn't need a WYSIWYG editor?
My dad doesn't need a WYSIWYG editor.
Okay. But your dad's not a customer. Come on now.
It's live. It's running on Pantheon.
Okay.
Loves it. We upgraded from Drupal 6. He's thrilled.
All right.
So that's actually one of my questions. Do you know of any companies or businesses that are using Backdrop for a customer right now that's live, or is planning to launch within the next 60 days or so?
I would guess there's a bunch of people, just because of the amount of activity we have going on in our contrib group with people porting modules and posting them all the time. I've seen a bunch of personal blogs, which I think are developer testing more than actual client production sites. I've seen, the sites that we've been working on. We've got the API site for Backdrop, api.backdropcms.org is running Backdrop. The backdropcms.org primary site is, we've got the Backdrop version up. We're doing a little final theming on it, and we'll launch here soon. So other than those, that's what we've been kind of head down working on lately. I don't know of anything else, but I would imagine that all of this activity is because people are building things with it. It's been a month, and we haven't heard of anything yet. So soon, I would guess.
Soon, I'm sure.
I would like to know, so the last time we spoke was in October of 2013, which I imagine your vision of this product has changed significantly since then. Or maybe not, man, I'm assuming that. But you guys decided to do this at some point, probably inspired by something, and I'm wondering what is different today. Like, do you envision the product that like a year and a half ago that is different than it is today? And how do you see this moving forward? What is the dynamic there for you?
So we did a lot of really extensive thinking about what Backdrop should be long before we forked. Nate and I have a lot of experience in the Drupal code and in the Drupal community, and we did a lot of thinking about what it would mean and what our principles should be and what should guide us before. And so I think that helped us set the direction before we started working on the code. And so I don't think it's actually changed that much since then. Nate, do you have a different perspective on that than I do?
No, I think actually what we got done, like we really wanted to make a release as soon as possible. Like it's really hard to get people enthusiastic about a product that doesn't even have a release yet. So getting out the initial version of Backdrop was pretty important to us, but we wanted to make sure we addressed like the major pain points of Drupal 7, which primarily is configuration management, deploying between environments. I think block positioning and site structure is still a really big issue in Drupal, unless you use panels. You know, panels really have solved that problem for Drupal 7 users. But with panels, views, and configuration management in Drupal 7, those were probably the most important things that we could have possibly done in the initial release of Backdrop, and we got those done. Unfortunately, we also had a bunch of other things that we wanted to do for the initial release. You know, things like the WYSIWYG, for example, which obviously I'm really passionate about, having done a whole bunch of work on that in Drupal 8, but it didn't get into Backdrop because it wasn't one of the highest priority things. So our vision of where we want to go has still been pretty much the same, but what we were able to accomplish, we just had to scale back a little bit just so that we could get out the initial release so that people could start using the software rather than us just talking about it forever. And
the rich text editor is also something that could go in after the initial release because it was a feature addition, as opposed to something like CMI, which required rewriting a lot of the stuff that was already in core. So some of our priorities weren't necessarily on what's most important, so much as what can we do after we release so that we can release first and add new stuff later. So that's why rich text got pushed back.
So, like, when I installed the product probably a month ago when you initially put the release out, and then I downloaded it again in the last 48 hours and looked at it again. So the rich text editor was an obvious thing for me, and there was no module for me to install. Like, there's just no way to address it that I could see. Am I right there? Am I wrong? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. But that's not the point of my question. So what are the good improvements, though? Let's talk a little bit about the improvements of what are the things that are great about, installing Backdrop?
So my favorite thing is if you're doing an upgrade from Drupal 7, it takes like 20 seconds to actually run update.php. It feels so fast, and I don't know if it's actually like, we didn't change very much from Drupal 7, so that update doesn't change very much, but there's something like really nice about like dum-da-dum-da-dum, swap out database, run update.php, ta-da, your site's done. And it just feels like, okay, now my theme is responsive, that's super fun, everything kind of looks the same, works the same, but it's snappier.
What about those modules that I used in Drupal 7?
Well, it depends on what they were.
Okay, right.
Yeah, a lot of them are in there, right? Like we've got admin menu moved into core. We've got path auto and token will be moved into core in the next version. We've got contrib versions of lots of common modules already ported, and people are working on.
Did you complete the entity API?
Yes.
Oh yeah, Actually, that's one funny thing that I was thinking about writing up a blog post about, like 7 weird things you didn't know about Backdrop or something like that, is that Backdrop is actually more object-oriented than Drupal 7 is. And a lot of people think that we're anti-object orientation. We're not. We're just not anti-procedural, basically. So Drupal 8 is trying really hard to remove all of its procedural code and replace everything with controllers. We're kind of more of the opinion that there's a place for both functional and object-oriented code. And all of our entities are actually now like actual real objects. So you can do like node arrow save And you can do that for comments, nodes, taxonomy terms, or any other entities. They're actually all classed objects now that can provide methods.
So then, if/when you port webform, is it going to use field API or whatever it is that webform uses? Or is it
For
just
those
going
of
to be...
you who are listening to the show, everyone's smiling right now. So we're looking forward to that answer.
Yeah, so will webform use fields has kind of been a long question in the Drupal 7 key, which is why we're all smiling, I think, because like people have been asking that for like 5 years or more, you know, and whether not that would happen in Drupal 7 or Drupal 8 or Backdrop. I still don't think that field API is the right tool for webform, because even in Drupal 8, and so Backdrop, the field API is largely the same, other than the fact that we're storing things in config. Field API is identical. That's actually one of the things that makes like porting like link or email modules so trivial, is that it's API-wise it's exactly the same. It's just that the way it's stored has been changed. So so as far as Backdrop is concerned, the situation is unchanged. As far as Drupal 8 is concerned, the field API even now is still kind of assumed that you could load every field on the entire website all at once. Like as far as I know, the loader for that is still happens all at once. So it's something with webform where you might have hundreds of sites hundreds of forms, and each one of those forms might have 10 to 20 different fields. It doesn't make it a very compatible paradigm as far as the assumptions that are in field API versus the way webform is built to basically be really large scale, like lots of different forms, lots of different fields. It still doesn't work real great with field API in either Drupal or Backdrop.
So we also, I remember having this debate with Nate probably at some Drupal camp recently, where we were talking about how in Drupal 8, the model for webform could just swap out the field storage too, because the way that fields are stored in webform is significantly different than the way that field data is stored in field API versus webform is very different. But in Drupal 8, you can swap out the field storage mechanism and say, oh, you can just say that if it's a webform field, it saves its data differently, and that might be an interesting model. But we've removed that swappable field storage from Backdrop, which makes it even less likely that fields might be a good use case for webform in the future in Backdrop.
Interesting.
Yeah, although I will say something that I am really looking forward to is webforms right now are part of nodes. They're very much tied into, like when you create a node, it's going to tile the webform configuration into a database. That is something that probably will change, because webforms really are much more like configuration than they are like content. Although it's nice that webforms are manageable by front-end like content creators. I think what we'll probably see is moving the configuration of webforms into config management instead of being tied into the nodes, which would make it so that you could do things like deploy changes to your web forms between environments in a way that was easy, as opposed to needing to like, I don't know. I don't even know how you move content between sites. It's so freaking difficult. Basically, I think the only way you can really do it is like write an update hook and then modify the node and then resave it. Like that's the only way you can really move configuration for web forms right now between different environments. It's really not a very easy thing to tackle. But if that was moved into config management, then like everything else, you could deploy between environments much more easily.
I mean, there's other ways to do it, but I mean, it's definitely not. it's definitely not fun.
Right.
So just if you give us the top 5 improvements for Backdrop over Drupal 7, what would they be for you guys?
So we have these actually, there's 6 reasons just right on the homepage of backdropcms.org. And so I don't need to really come up with these, thank goodness, because we've already got them. Number one is well, actually, I don't know, we've got these a little bit out of order. I think number one for developers is config management, like hands down. Like that is just the de facto reason why you would want to get off of Drupal 7.
And does it work?
Oh yeah, it works fantastic.
All right,
You can, yeah. I mean, almost everything. Like, if you actually look at the database tables between Drupal 7 and Backdrop, like half of them are gone because it's like, node types, vocabularies, menus, like all of these.
So your configuration management, what does it mean for me as a developer? What can I do to use that in your system, and it will work?
So what you would do is you'd, for example, build a website on your local computer, and then you're ready to deploy it.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can just move the whole thing exactly like you move a Drupal site up to live. But then your client says, hey, I need this new feature. You build the new feature on your local site. But you're like, now what do I do? You can just export. There's a user interface. You can go to it and say export config, and it'll generate a compressed config archive, which you then import into your live site. And ta-da! All of your changes are there.
So it does it or does it not have the whole Drupal 8 needing some kind of unique identifier that matches exactly type system, or can you just import? Does it do any sort of checks when you import config to see if it should be? I mean,
it does a lot of checks.
Yeah.
Nate, I don't know about the unique identifier problem.
So Nick's point is that in Drupal 8 currently is that one system had to be cloned from another, and they started at the same point with an identifier, and the only way you can move stuff from point A to point B is if they started as the same system.
Yeah, they need to share the exact UUID, otherwise it just fails outright.
Yeah, what we have is we use UUIDs in a couple of places. Things like block placement, for example. You can place a block in more than one location, and if the UUIDs don't line up, then it's going to assume that a block has been removed and a different block has been added somewhere. But we're not using UUIDs quite as comprehensively as Drupal 8 because we're much more dependent upon machine names. Almost everything has a machine name. I guess that's true in Drupal 8 as well. But we're slightly less comprehensive in that we're not dealing with things like deletions, for example. Like if you delete a field, what happens in Backdrop is it does a validation and says, you've got to go delete that field in the user interface before I can do the import. And that saves us an enormous amount of overhead and an enormous amount of problems, because things like when you delete a field, let's say that field happens to be a file field, that requires a batch API process to go through and delete all of the content and then delete all of the files that are associated with that field. Like deleting a file field could take like 20 minutes or something like that. So rather than dealing with deletion, we throw a validation thing, or just saying, please delete the field first and then do the import again. And that saves us a lot of overhead and a lot of problems with things having the same name but being different.
Do you see that your CMI is a replacement for features?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Well,
right. Which is what Drupal 8 does not consider it, I don't think.
Well,
so we still envision a place for features in Backdrop, and what it will be is a tool that lets you bundle sets of configuration together. So it's actually something that will create each feature rather than something that's actually used for deployment, which is what we use it for most of the time now in Drupal 7. So if somebody wanted to create a features module for Backdrop, it would basically say, these config files are what you need in order to build your blog, and these config files are what you need to build your slideshow. That kind of, the original vision for features could still exist in Backdrop, but you don't need it for deployment. It's just the bundling.
So if I have a distribution or a multi-site and I update something, I can kind of just push that configuration to all the different sites, and it will grab it. Is there a way to do that with REST or something, or do I have to kind of upload it through the UI?
So you can also manage your config in version control. So if you wanted to deploy it that way, we have two directories just like Drupal 8 and active and staging, and you import always from staging. So if you wanted to manage your directories in version control, you can do that. You can deploy code into the staging directory and then run the importer. We recommend that you currently run that importer process through the user interface, because that's where Backdrop will need to do things like create update hooks to create, or run update processes to do things like create tables to store the data on fields you've just deployed. But we will eventually get Jush support. We're working on that right now too, and then we'll probably have Jush commands that you can run to do that as well.
All right. So what are the other key features that is an improvement for Backdrop? So we got CMI. What else would you guys say is the next two or three
layout
items?
system is definitely one of my favorite new things. Panels was my favorite module in Drupal 7, and so it should be no surprise that I'm super excited about layouts in Backdrop. We've solved the block placement problem, and it also changes a lot about how you create themes and how you even need to conceptually think about a theme for Backdrop. A theme doesn't control where anything is on the page. It's only a skin, right? The layout is more like content than it is like design. And so there's kind of a significant separation between a layout, which is a top-level item just like a modular theme. You can drop it in and your content can choose to use it. And a theme, which just covers that layout with a color or a font or something like that. So layouts is pretty neat. It ships in Backdrop with 3 layouts by default, or 4 now. So we've got a left and a right column option, and they're all responsive out of the box. So as long as you don't put any layout style in your theme, all of your sites will be responsive too. And then of course, if people have more comprehensive theme layout needs, they can provide their own layouts and theme them in their themes and all of that stuff. But for starters, you've got responsive sites, which is, I think, a huge step in the right direction.
So Jen, you've introduced a new word called layout that doesn't exist in Drupal 7, right? It doesn't exist anywhere in Drupal at all. So that's a differentiator here, right?
Yeah, so anyone who's had experience working with panels, there was a plugin for layouts before, and you could either put those panels layout plugins in a module, or you could put them in a theme, which is a bad idea because your site could crash. But either way, the concept was something we stole directly from panels in Drupal 7. We just implemented it differently. It's more like if you've used the Panels Everywhere module, it's a layout that replaces your page template, rather than one that replaces just the content block, which is how Panels usually works.
Yeah, it's similar to Page Manager looks too. So I have a question. I was playing with layouts, and this is kind of a more general question. What's your bug reporting process?
So we have an issue on GitHub. If you go to Backdrop on GitHub, we have 2 projects. There's one called Backdrop itself, which is the code repository, and there's one called Backdrop -issues, and you can report bugs in there. So if it's a user experience problem, if you can tag it with like UX and square brackets, we have some user experience people who review all of those issues, and those are things where you can usually get fixes in for right away. And that goes for all bugs, not just layout bugs. So if anyone's testing anything and you find any problems. One thing we have been really good at, Backdrop's been out for a month. We're already on version 1.03. Those minor point releases are bug fix releases. So as soon as we find any problems, we'll kind of evaluate, like, okay, we'll get them all fixed and say, how urgent are these? Should we ship a release right now, or should we wait until next week, or do we need to coordinate with the Drupal security team? And then we'll just roll out those point releases at any time. So fixes go in all the time. We don't need to wait for 1.1 or May 15th in order to get those in. So.
All right, we're sort of coming to the end of the show here. I just want to ask another question here before we move to the module of the week. If Drupal came to you and said, we'd like to move Backdrop in for the next major release of Drupal 7, like just replace what we have now, because you guys have done some great work. Is that an option for you guys, or you just want to go in a new direction?
So
That's an interesting question.
Yeah,
I think it's not an option for Drupal. I don't know if it's an
I'm
option.
not sure why, but okay.
yeah. Actually, here I'll try to answer. When we were first thinking about doing this, just before and just after, actually, we actually made GitHub repository, and people found out about us. Um, we actually did have a conversation with Angie Webchick Byron about like whether or not we could maintain the Drupal 7 code base as a Drupal product and keep the Drupal name. But basically, at that point, the answer was no. That Drupal is Drupal 8, and that is the direction of the project. And separating them into something like a Drupal 7 Plus or something like that basically would dilute the brand that is Drupal. And so we actually kind of would have preferred that be the case because, well, in a lot of ways, because it would have made it a lot less work for us. The amount of work that we've had to pour into just infrastructure has been pretty tremendous. Replacing Drupal.org and all of the functionality that it provides. In addition to that, all of the struggle that we've had just with image and audience and telling people, no, this is for Drupal developers. Like, we love Drupal. That's why we did this, is because we like Drupal. That entire process has been really hard. And I think if we could have maintained this within the Drupal ecosystem, like, it would have been good in a lot of ways, that we would have had something that we liked in the short term that was available sooner than Drupal 8, as it turns out, more compatible with what we know, and would have stayed within the Drupal ecosystem. But long term, it just would have been really hard to continue down that path, because we really do want to make Backdrop sustainable and keep the code compatible for a long time and stay along the trajectory that we're going. But that would have been really hard within the Drupal ecosystem, because what would have happened is that Drupal 7 Plus would have eventually come to an end of life, just like Drupal 7 itself. Right. And that's not something that we want to do. We want there to be a Backdrop 2 and 3 and 4. And so we'll continue developing the product as something that stands alone. So early on, that might have been an option, but now it's just kind of it's done.
Nate, you've a couple of times throughout our conversation, you've mentioned that Backdrop is taking up a majority of your time, and I'm sure it's taking up a majority of Jen's time too, which is pretty obvious. I mean, you're building a CMS. That's no small task. Do you feel like the amount of time that Backdrop is taking is adversely impacting your involvement with Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 development and maintenance for the number of modules that you're involved in, and porting those to Drupal 8 as well as fixes for Drupal 7?
Yeah. So it's definitely adversely affecting our involvement in Drupal 8. But I think that, at least speaking for myself, I've got a bunch of co-maintainers who I've kind of released control of a bunch of my modules to, and said, up front, I will not be working on Drupal 8 versions of these modules. If anyone wants to work on them, let me know. If anyone's already, a co-maintainer, I've kind of said, here, you take this in whatever direction you want to go in it. And that is really the majority of the time goes into how do you take this thing from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, not into reviewing patches that people are posting for Drupal 7. So just taking the transition to 8 off of my plate has freed up a bunch of time that I can then spend working on Backdrop stuff.
Yeah, I would say my core involvement is definitely, core is just different now, because previously, like, I was working on developing new functionality and features in Drupal 8. I'm not doing that anymore, but I am still finding like a good amount of stuff. It doesn't happen very often with Drupal 8, honestly, but I found a bunch of stuff in Backdrop that affects Drupal 7, like various like performance issues or just bugs. And when I fix them in Backdrop, it fixes them in Drupal 7 as well. And so a lot of times I'll see or I'll contribute cross patches that say I did this for Backdrop. It just happens to work exactly the same for Drupal 7, and it fixes a problem there. So my core involvement has shifted from trying to make new functionality in Drupal 7 to like stabilizing Drupal, or sorry, new functionality in Drupal 8 to stabilizing Drupal 7, in various ways, because that's where the overlap is. In the contrib world, I don't have as much time to manage a lot of my projects, but like Jen, I'm doing or trying to do everything I can to hand off those projects for the Drupal 8 release cycle. I know I've already handed off Facebook OAuth, external links, webform. We've got a couple of people that are interested in doing Drupal 8 version, but I don't think it's gotten very much traction. So as far as Drupal 8 goes, I probably won't be porting modules to Drupal 8, but I'm still maintaining the Drupal 7 ones as best I can.
Okay. So before we get to our module of the week, I'll ask anyone, does anyone have any last questions or comments they want to make before we move on and close the show?
I got one wrap-up question.
All right, thank you.
We talked about, obviously we talked about, developing for Drupal, developing for Backdrop. You're doing a lot of stuff on GitHub right now, which is awesome. Where would you guys, if this is kind of a two-parter, but if you were going to suggest somebody to somebody that was new to Backdrop, they wanted to learn about Backdrop, how to install it, how to work with it, and then B, they were having problems and they needed support. For Drupal, people go to Drupal.org and they post a ticket or they read a thread. Where would you suggest people go for Backdrop for that kind of support and information?
So on a high level, if you just want some information about Backdrop, our primary website, backdropcms.org, has kind of the hit list of things you need to know. It has a quick user guide, some basic documentation. We do have plans to add more there as things go on, but right now it's just kind of a abbreviated, the handbook is a handbook you can read in one sitting. So if you're interested in doing that, it's a good place to start. If you're using Backdrop and you've got questions, there's a couple of different avenues you can go for support. The issue queue is something that we manage in GitHub. So it's GitHub/backdrop/backdrop-issues is where you can go to ask questions. There's a tag you can add for question, and people will answer that. Nate and I are on GitHub all the time. Or if GitHub is not your thing, like you're not a developer, you don't have a GitHub account, and that's not somewhere you feel comfortable creating an issue, we also have a subreddit, which I think is Reddit/Backdrop as well. And there's a bunch of people just having more casual conversations in there about, how do I do this on Backdrop? How does Backdrop solve this problem? Should I use Backdrop for this use case? Kind of a more casual environment. We also set up a bunch of Backdrop groups, a whole bunch of other places, just because we don't have a forum like Drupal.org, and we wanted to give people a place to try things. We have a Facebook group, we have a LinkedIn group, but it seems like everybody is on this subreddit. So if you want answers quickly, the subreddit is probably the best place to go. All the other things are kind of out there for people to try, but they haven't really taken hold as much as the subreddit has.
Just a quick note, it's reddit/r/backdrop.
Thank you.
Anyone else with an ending question for Ben and Nate? Nick, you good?
Nope,
I'm
I'm
good.
good.
Okay, how about before we get to the module of the week, Jen and Nate, what would you like to say before we close out today? Any points you want to highlight?
So one thing that I kind of mentioned that we breezed over is that you can try Backdrop on Pantheon right now if you just want to take it for a spin. If you go to getpantheon.com/backdrop, if you already have a Pantheon dashboard, you can just drop one in and start playing with it right away, which is great. You can also host your Backdrop sites on Pantheon. I have a live site up there already. When we roll out bug fix releases, there's just a big button on your page that lets you apply them directly to your live site or your dev site first to test and then deploy to live, just like you do with Drupal. So we've got some support from hosting providers, which is really great. I would just say that's probably the number one thing I'd like people to know, so you can go and, if you're a developer, get into the code, take a look, see what you think. Let us know.
Okay, for anyone listening to, we have a link in the show notes for that as well. Anything from you, Nate, before we close out?
Yeah, I want to say, this is the first podcast we've been on since we did the release, actually. The Lullabot podcast, Hacking Culture, was filmed, recorded a couple weeks in advance, and then just released on release day of Backdrop. So this is the first time I've had the opportunity to say like how pleased I am with the overall result and how happy I am with everything that we've produced and the amazing small community that we've already built up that has been investing an enormous, maybe not even enormous, but they've been investing a consistent amount of time into Backdrop, making and producing this basically new piece of software. And it's been quite a ride just trying to build out like this new small community. And I'm really thankful for all of the contributors that we've had, the people that are just keeping an open mind and even just trying it for the first time. It's just a huge help, even if they only file like a single bug report or something like that. It's been great seeing, something like this just take shape and turn into something new.
Yeah, it's funny, Nate. When we had you guys on back in October of 2013, I think we got off that call on our side and said, "There's no way in hell these guys are going to do this thing." Like, and then here we are, months later, and saying this thing is already in release, which is really impressive. And whether you agree with what you guys are doing philosophically here in terms of forking or not, or should you stay with Drupal? I mean, what you've done is really impressive. You have a release product out, and which is what spawned us to say, hey, we need to have these guys back on here because they did exactly what they said they were going to do, which we don't get often, by the way.
Yeah, I think one of the most impressive pieces for me is that you're able to launch so much earlier than Drupal 8. I think that's where a lot of the skepticism was. That I think each of us on the show have predicted Drupal 8 as being out for at least 5 months at this point. so being able to get out with that much of a jump really is certainly going to help your momentum. And I think the other really surprising piece is a lot of the the backporting from Drupal 8 to Backdrop has been pretty successful. I mean, I think the only really big piece, well, there's two big pieces that you don't have, and that's WYSIWYG, which you're going to have next month, and the other really, really big one, which I don't suspect you plan on doing anytime soon, is the multilingual support, which is certainly understandable at the stage that you're at. So, I mean, it's very impressive, how far you've come.
We do have multilingual support. We just don't have better multilingual support than Drupal 7. So Drupal 8 has done a lot of work to make that better. We ran into some stumbling blocks with CMI that we now have solutions for. We just haven't implemented them yet. So we have plans for better multilingual support than Drupal 7. But that's also something that's going to be kind of hard to get into a current release. So yeah, we've got plans for everything, but only so much time.
All right, so as we end here, I've just made a decision we're going to punt the module of the week. I just want to get some feedback from Jason. Not Jason, sorry. Jason's not here. John and Nick. John, do you have a different impression today on Backdrop than you had before this call or in the past? I'm just curious on your input.
Different impression. Yes, I would say I do have a different impression.
Yep. What is it?
I don't know. I don't know what my different impression is. I just know it's different.
All right.
I think when we last talked to Nate and Jen, I was skeptical at the ability to get something out that was going to be useful, and get it to a full release, and support it, and have the contrib modules there. That seemed like a really big undertaking to me. And as we just said, they've done everything that they said they were going to do. So I think that is that's part of me changing my opinion. I'm still a little skeptical as to how I would go about selling this to a client, and areas in which there are no contrib modules or lack in support. But that's not.
So John, so I'm going to interrupt you here a little bit. So it's not about selling this to your customer, it's also selling it internally. You work for a successful agency that has lots of customers. It's also selling it internally as a solution to deliver. So I think that's where maybe I'm speaking for you a little bit here, but I think it's about selling it to your company as a solution, right?
I don't think so, because we're multidisciplinary. We do WordPress, we do Drupal, we do custom CMS stuff when need be.
So could you see this as being I'm a WordPress, I'm a Drupal, and I'm a backdrop agency?
Yeah, I mean that I'm not obviously making business decisions, because that's way above my pay grade. But if there is a place for it, if there is a way to sell it to clients, then there's definitely a place for it in our toolbox, without a doubt. And that's what I'm having a hard time overcoming right now is how to sell it and where where it fits in for our current user client base.
So really quickly, I think that sales pitch is going to be hard for you today. I think when Drupal 8 is out, you're not going to be able to sell Drupal 7 anymore, because everyone's going to want, if they want Drupal, they want the latest Drupal. And then you're going to have this gap between selling the WordPress site and selling the Drupal 8 site, where you feel like it could go either way, but maybe there's something that's in the middle, that you need more than WordPress but less than Drupal 8, and that's when you're going to be able to sell Backdrop. The reason that we have Backdrop now is because we want to take the time between now and when Drupal 8 gets out to fill that gap in the modules that you're worried about. And in order to do that, we need to have a product that people are running, that are actively interested in writing those modules for. So I wouldn't worry so much about selling Backdrop to those clients today, because that's, it's early. But after Drupal 8 gets out, now you're just going to have another option, something that's kind of more comfortable in the middle there.
And I think that's a great point. I mean, I'm not really worried about selling this to my clients. My clients listen to what I tell them, and if they don't, they're not my clients. I mean, that's what it comes down to. I think really it's that gap, and being a freelancer, I don't have the resources necessarily to port all those modules or support it if it goes off and doesn't get the popularity that we think it will.
Nick,
I mean,
do you see Backdrop as an option for you moving forward?
I think moving forward, it would become an option for me in one major case. I mean, if Drupal 8 takes more than a year to come out, and when it comes out, it's changed to the point where I can't use it myself comfortably on mid-sized projects, which may or may not be the case. I mean, it may come out. I mean, where we thought it would be out, I thought it would be out at least 3 months ago at the latest, and we're now thinking it's probably going to be January. If we come around October and they're still saying Drupal 8 is going to be 6 months a year, and Backdrop has most of the contrib modules, and Backdrop has most of the, it has 5,000, 10,000 installs, then I might start considering it. But
yeah,
it's a big if.
So I disagree with you in that I don't feel like Backdrop is a fallback, which is how you're positioning it. I think it's a different direction. From what I'm hearing from our guest today is that Backdrop is not about Drupal 8 is not here, so let's do something else. I think it's about a different approach. All right, we're actually at the point that we need to end the show. So we have a couple of hard stops here. I mean, like a lot of the episodes we have, we could talk for like probably 3 hours. At some point, we need to stop, and sometimes we don't elegantly end at a solution, but we're gonna stop today. So Jen and Nate, thanks for coming on again. Maybe in 12 months we just have an update to see where you guys are and how things are going.
A standing 6-month backdrop.
Yeah, a backdrop show. I know that the hosts of this show appreciate what you guys are doing, and and would like to support you in any way we can. I think we did it financially last time. So tell us what anyone listening today what could they do to support you if they like what you're doing. Tell us about that, and then we can close out.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that I mean, we need help in a lot of areas, but it's really easy if you want to contribute. There are a couple of things you can do no matter who you are. One is if you just like the idea of Backdrop, the concept behind it, or you'll hope that there's a future for it even. You can go to backdropcms.org, and down at the bottom of the page there's a form to just show your support. So that just involves uploading a logo for your company, or even just including your name, and just saying, I support the idea of Backdrop. And we're just trying to gain momentum, saying, people should be okay and comfortable pursuing Backdrop and not feel like it's a threat to the Drupal community or their job or whatever. If you're a developer, hop into the GitHub Backdrop repository and start looking at issues or file a bug report. If you're a contrib developer, take a look at porting your module over to Backdrop. It's a really easy process. It's actually, it's kind of fun to see it in action. So there's that option too for developers. And financially, we have a way for you to donate to us on backdropcms.org as well. So if you're just interested in supporting the project, we have a lot of infrastructure needs. And we use those fundings, that funding for code sprints, for infrastructure, for design resources, and all of the things that come with running an open source project. Anything else, Jen?
Nope, that's all I was thinking of. Oh, well, just take it for a spin. Try it.
Oh, yeah, and if nothing else, just try it. Yeah, I think that would be...
I like it.
Yeah, exactly.
Great.
So that's it.
Thank you guys for joining us today. John, how about you?
How about me? You can find me on all the social networks at John Picozzi, and always on at umthink.com.
Great. And Nick?
You can find me online at Nixvan, Nicxvan, pretty much everywhere. And I suppose always online at enlighten.net, but I'm not going to spell that because nobody ever gets it right. So just ping me on Twitter, Nixvan, and I'll be glad to talk to anybody who has any questions.
All right, great. So I'm Stephen Cross, at Stephen with a PH, Cross on Twitter. And just to clarify, you can find Backdrop at backdropcms.com, right?
.org. Well, they both work, but .org.
Okay. All right, so backdropcms.org. So let's get that URL in there. Hey, thanks everyone, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.
Thanks so much for having us.